Dear friends, thank you for joining me on part 2 of this lecture series. Today I'm going to talk about reliability, and it's a part of another talk, reliability plus validity. Today I'll be focusing only on reliability. So we'll get started. So I just want to recap what we learned a bit yesterday. An ideal diagnostic accuracy study is one where you have patients of a specific group with a suspected disease. Everybody has the index test. Everybody has the standard reference test done. The reference test positive is called disease. Reference test negative is called no disease. The index test can be positive or negative. When both are positive, it's called true positive. When the reference test and the index test are negative, it's called true negative. If the reference standard is negative, meaning no disease, but your test claims positive, it is false positive. If the reference test is negative, meaning no disease, positive, but your meaning that you have disease, and your index test is negative, then it's called false negative test. We're talking about the index test. This is just a brief recap about yesterday's diagnostic study introduction. Now, when we talk about diagnostic tests, how good are these diagnostic tests doing? Now, there are two ways of looking at a diagnostic test to see whether the diagnostic test is doing well or not. One is called validity. The other is called reliability. So the important thing to note is that both of them are test measures. Both reliability and validity are test measures for diagnostic studies. They are both separate. They don't mean the same thing. And they have to be done separately. So both are measures of telling you how good your diagnostic study is, but both are separate. Let's look at the meaning of these two in a little bit more detail. Reliability means the extent to which repeated measures of a stable phenomenon fall closely to each other. So if I take your blood pressure 5 times in 5 minutes, means every minute I take your blood pressure, we generally think the blood pressure won't change much in 5 minutes. We expect to get almost the same value every time. Now that's called reliability. If you get the same value every time in 5 minutes of your blood pressure check, that's reliable. Some other words are reproducibility and precision. Suppose there are two psychiatrists. Both are checking the same person for depression. So two investigators. None of them is a gold standard, but we just want to know how closely they are both agreeing. Both of them should find depression is there at the same time, or both should say that there is no depression in this patient at the same time. That's called reliability. So in reliability, you don't have to have something called a gold standard. Two people or more are checking the same phenomenon at near more or less the same time. That's reliability. Validity, on the other hand, is slightly different. Validity is more like the slide I presented earlier. Here you have a reference standard or a gold standard against which you are comparing an index test. So the validity is a degree to which results of a measurement correspond to the true state of the phenomenon being measured. Now, the true state of the phenomenon is reflected by the gold standard. So the gold standard positive means you have disease, and the gold standard negative or the reference standard negative means you have no disease. So we are checking this true state of the phenomenon against your index test. How accurate is your index test as compared to a reference standard or a gold standard? So that is called validity, or also called accuracy. So just remember that very often people use these words interchangeably: reliability, validity. They are different. Or reproducibility and accuracy, they are different. The truth in a validity comes from a gold standard test, which may be histopathology, culture, MRI, or a prospective follow-up. So you have to have in validity a test which is called the truth or the reference standard or a gold standard, against which you're comparing a new test to see how accurate is your new test as compared to the gold standard. Today's class is going to be only on reliability. So we're going to go in depth about reliability. The extent to which repeated measurements. So your reliability is when you're doing repeated measurements of a stable phenomenon. Now let us say the blood pressure is stable across a few minutes, then you're happy. But suppose you check the blood pressure every hour for 24 hours. We know that the blood pressure fluctuates throughout the day. So you don't expect to get reliable measurements of blood pressure over the same whole day. But over a 5-minute period, the blood pressure doesn't change much. Unless, of course, somebody sees a tiger or sees a snake and the blood pressure shoots up in that 5 minutes. Generally, blood pressure is stable over a few minutes. So the repeating of blood pressure, that is a stable phenomenon, you hope to get similar results. Not exactly the same, but they must fall close to each other. The words I told you, it's also called precision and reproducibility. So some other people define it as a capacity of a test to give the same result on repeated application within a similar time span. That's the definition of reliability. Now, what does reliability depend on? So the variability in a specific manifestation. So if the blood pressure fluctuates wildly over 5 minutes, then clearly the measurement will not sound reliable. But that is because the biological phenomenon itself is highly variable. So we should check reliability only when we are sure that whatever measurement we are doing is not wildly fluctuant over that time period. Next, variability depends on the measurement method, how you measure it. So the device which you use to check blood pressure should be a reasonably good device. If that has got many errors, then you won't get a reliable estimate. Thirdly, the blood pressure may be a good measure. The device may be good. The BP may not fluctuate, but maybe one measure is done by a student and the second measure of the blood pressure done by an expert doctor or a nurse or some other healthcare professional who checks blood pressure often, then you will have a variation. The skill of the person doing it also affects the reliability. So one measure of reliability is a degree of dispersal of repeated measurements. And as statisticians, you're all familiar with variance or standard deviation. Now, is there any connection between reliability and validity? Now, highly reliable test does not imply or guarantee validity. So you can't say that a highly reliable test will have high sensitivity and specificity. No, that's not a guaranteed outcome. However, if the test is highly unreliable, it is probable that the test won't be very sensitive or specific. So generally, don't connect a highly reliable test being highly valid. But you know the test is not very reliable. It is unlikely. We can't say it will not be. It is unlikely that it will be sensitive or specific. Sensitive or specific are the words used in validity. Now, this is a slide which is often used, and I'm not very sure that many people agree with it, but it is an example which I found, it helps me to understand the concept of reliability and validity. I'm sure you may be very familiar with it. Forgive me if I am repeating this. Here you are shooting at a particular target and you want to see how reliable and valid your gun is. Maybe the gun or the shooter. The first example, you find that all the bullets have all hit in a very narrow area. It is repeatedly hitting at the same area. But remember, this is where it should have hit, but repeatedly it's hitting in the same area. So it's very reliable. It's reliably hitting in the same area, but it is not the truth. The validity means it should have hit here. This is the true area where the gun should have hit. So this is an example of a test which is highly reliable. It keeps on giving you the same value at a point of time, but it's not valid because it's not giving you the correct result. Now look at this test. It's not reliable because the same gun shooting at the same time is giving you different target areas. So it is not even very close results. It should have been all close together. Secondly, the results on average are not close to the center of the target, which is the truth where it should have hit. So this is an example of a test which is neither reliable nor is it valid. And this is an example of a test. You can see that all the bullets have hit very far away from each other. So they're not reliable. But you see, they're all circled around the center point here. So on the average, if you take all these values, the average would be close to the center. So this is not reliable, but it is valid. This is not very commonly seen. As I told you from a previous example, generally unreliable tests are not valid, but you may get some situation like that. And lastly, this is a test which you hope to always get. The values of your repeated very close to each other are always the same. And the values are accurate to what it is supposed to represent. So this is an example of a test which is both reliable and valid. Now, as you can notice from this, reliability is intrinsic to the measurement. Validity is external to the measurement because the validity, you're comparing it with the gold standard, something else. Reliability is about repeatability and random error. There'll always be some error in that. That's what reliability is about. Validity, you're talking about the truth and systematic error. Systematically is the value away from what it's supposed to be. So this is about reliability and validity. I hope that is clear. Now, this is the same thing I'm just going to explain in another way because some of you may enjoy this a bit better. There are three people in every story. There is the instrument or the blood pressure measurement. There's the observer who could be the doctor, the nurse or healthcare provider. And then there's a patient. So the sources of variability in reliability could be in any of these three. The observers may vary among, it may be two different observers. If there are two different observers, you say inter-observer variability. If it is the same observer doing it many times himself, it is intra-observer variability. The second is the variability of the instrument. Maybe the instrument is not very good. It keeps on fluctuating. It's got some problem with the instrument or the method. And the third is the subject itself. Now, as I told you, the blood pressure doesn't generally change over 5 minutes. But in the middle of the 5 minutes, he thought of some movie, or he suddenly got worried about something, or he became more anxious, the blood pressure would have shot up. So generally, there are random errors, and time is also important in variability. Now, I just want to recap again the usual diagnostic test. You have a study sample, you have an index test, which can be positive or negative. You have a reference standard in both areas. They can be positive or negative. And you have to compare it against, so the reference standard positive is called true positive. And the reference standard is negative, that you say no disease. But if the index test is positive, then you say this is a false positive. And similarly, if the index test is negative and the reference standard is negative, you are happy. If the index test is negative, but the reference standard is positive, you say it's a false negative, and you estimate accuracy, sensitivity, specificity. This is about the validity of a test, different from reliability. So the reason I mentioned this, and I know this is what I'm going to take in the next class on the coming Wednesday, but just to compare it with the validity measures. So the measures of reliability, how do you talk about reliability? Once again, I'm sure that as statisticians, this is very familiar to you all, but I hope it is of value to you all. So how do you measure reliability? Now, in the PICO statement I told you yesterday, patient, intervention, control, and outcome. If the outcome measure is bivariate, or categorical, then you can use a kappa statistic. If the outcome measure is ordinal, is polytomous or nominal, we must do a weighted kappa. If the outcome measures are continuous, you can do intra-class correlation coefficient. Now let's get into the first one, where the outcome measure is bivariate or categorical, and we'll talk about kappa first. So in kappa test, let us see this example. This is taken from David Sackett's book in 1991. And I would like to acknowledge that I have got a lot of material from Dr. J. Seelan. So I'm very thankful to him for sharing this material with me to use to teach you all. So there are two clinicians who are looking at the eye of a diabetic patient. And the diabetic patient can have no retinal injury, which is no retinopathy, or he can have quite severe disease or moderate disease. So the same patient is looked at by two doctors, the first clinician and the second clinician. So total 100 patients are looked at by both people. If both of them agree that there's little or no disease, 46 out of 100. And in 32 out of 100, they both agreed it was quite severe disease. Whereas in 12 people, the first person said moderately severe disease, whereas the second person said little or no disease. In these 10 patients, the first clinician said there's little disease, whereas the second person said there is moderate or severe disease. So the two clinicians disagreed in these 22 times, but they seem to agree in about 78 out of 100. So commonly people will just say agreement is 78 out of 100. So often that was the way in which people reported agreement statistics. Remember here, there is no gold standard. Neither of them are saying gold standard. They both have been taught how to look at retinopathy. So presumably they should agree 100% of the time. Here we're looking at agreement. How much do they two agree with each other? Now, important, just remember the totals here. The first clinician said little or no 56 times. The second clinician said little or no 58 times. So the probability that the doctor one said no is 56 out of 100. The probability that doctor 2 said no is 58 out of 100. The probability that both of them would have said little or no is 0.56 into 0.8, which is about 32.5%. If you look at the similar totals from the previous slide, 42 out of 100, the second clinician said yes. And 44 out of 100, the first clinician said yes. So the probability that both said yes is 0.44 into 0.42, which is about 18.5%. So here we come to a new number now. The overall probability of a chance agreement is 32.5% plus 18.5%, which is 51%. Now the next figure is something which is commonly seen by many people. Again, it is taken from Dr. Sackett's book. The agreement could be 0% or the agreement could be complete, which is 100%. Here, if you remember, the overall observed agreement is 78%. How did we get 78%? 46 plus 32. And this is an example. So the total number is 100. So the percentages work out very easy. So 78 is the observed agreement. And the chance agreement we said is 51%. So the observed agreement is this number, 78%. Based on chance alone, we have said there is 51% of agreement, which is 32.5 for saying yes and for no and then yes. So 32 plus 18.5, 51% is the observed agreement based on chance. So the rest of it is beyond chance. So the potential agreement beyond chance is actually 49%, this whole amount. Of that, the actual agreement beyond chance is 27%. How did we get 27%? Observed agreement is 78%. The agreement based on chance is 51. So the agreement beyond chance is 27%. So how did kappa get calculated? The actual agreement beyond chance is 27%. So we put that on numerator. The potential agreement beyond chance could have been this whole amount, which is 49%. 49% is 51% minus 100. So 49%. So the actual agreement beyond chance, 27%, divided by the potential agreement beyond chance, which is 49%. This is whole amount. So the kappa is 55 or 0.55. That is the kappa statistics. Now, you may like to put it in statistical terms. The observed probability minus the expected probability divided by 1 minus the expected probability. So kappa measures the amount of agreement beyond that which could be accepted by chance as a proportion of the maximal agreement beyond chance. Now, if you put it in these symbols, P0 minus PC divided by 1 minus PC. So the observed agreement is 0.78. The chance agreement is 0.51. 1 minus a chance agreement is 1 minus 0.51. And we come to 0.55. So this is how the mathematical formula of kappa is calculated. So here's another example. This is again hypothetical data. 2 laboratories are checking for a sexually transmitted disease, gonorrhea. They have 300 subjects. The first laboratory says 10 are positive. The second say 12 are positive. And this is the place where they agree. They both say 5 are positive. They both agree on 283 being negative. They disagree on 7 and 5, which is about 12. So the overall, so one of the things to look at is the prevalence of disease. The overall prevalence is about 4%. It's between 10 and 12 and 10 out of 300. The observed agreement is 96%. The chance agreement is 92%. Now, the reason I'm telling you this important slide is that it appears that, this totally 5 plus 283 is 288 out of 300. Very good agreement. But here you see, because the chance agreement is 92%, the agreement beyond chance, the kappa is only 0.43. Now, this is done in a part of a cross-sectional study. Now, this is one method where we are doing a cross-sectional study. The 2 tests are done at the same time. Now, there's another thing called test-retest method. This is a time sample. So again, test-retest reliability could be used in time samples. So here we are testing the consistency of a measure from one time to another time. So test-retest is the most conservative method of testing reliability. So there are 2 important components to that. One is you must implement your measurement instrument at 2 separate times for each subject. So I can check your blood pressure now and maybe your blood pressure after class. Maybe you got so angry with my class that your blood pressure went up. Some other of my students said, sir, your voice is so droning that I feel like falling asleep and my blood pressure will go down. So I'm just saying, so you must do the blood pressure before my class and after my class. And you need to assume that there is no change in the underlying condition between the 2, test 1 and test 2. Test 2 is the blood pressure before my class and the test 2 is the blood pressure after my class. So clearly, if my class has an effect on your blood pressure, then this assumption is not correct. So you must test the method twice, once before and after a point of time. And your assumption is that the measurement doesn't change between the 2 times. So this is test-retest method. So if you got cases in this first column are the subjects, there are 10 subjects, and you have done a score at time 1 and the score at time 2. And the assumption is that the score should not change between the 2 times. So you can see that, this first person, the score was 40 and 42, not bad. The second person, it was 30 and 41, not so good. And so on and so forth. So now we want to know how can we calculate a kappa for this test and retest reliability. So the issue in test and retest is there are carryover effects. Carryover effect means when I test the first time, does that change the value of the second time? So in other words, if I check the blood pressure at time 1, does it change the blood pressure at time 2? So there should not be a carryover effect. The second is the practice effect. I became very good in checking the blood pressure the first time. The second time, maybe I became more accurate. So there should not be a practice effect. The third question to ask yourself is a time interval. How much time can there be between testing once and testing two the second time, so that there won't be too much of biological change in the value between the time interval? So you must question how much time interval is allowed or acceptable biologically. Then the next thing is it's expensive. Suppose you have to do the same test 2 times, you have to pay for the 2 tests. So test retest is an expensive method of doing it, of checking the diagnostic ability of a test. The last problem is attrition. So the only way you can do a test retest is if you got values at both times. So for example, if the third person, you have a value at time 1 and time 2, he went away somewhere and said, I don't want to be part of your study, or went for a movie, or said, this is too much for me, then you have a big problem of attrition. 1 or 2 is all right, but if the attrition becomes large, you have a problem. So the next thing is called internal consistency. Now, if I ask you, does this person have mania or some other mental illness? Now, or the patient is happy, or how did you like my class? And I give you 3 or 4 questions. All of them should give you the similar kind of answers. All the questions within that particular score should give you the same kind of answers. So internal consistency is generally to test the consistency of results across items within a test. Meaning you have 4 questions for depression, and you want to see if all of them are telling the same thing. The answer to one question shouldn't indicate that the guy is actually happy, and the other 3 questions indicating he's depressed. Then there is no internal consistency of the items within that diagnostic test questionnaire. So you are judging by estimating how well the items reflect the same construct and they yield the similar results. It is based on intercorrelations between the items. All the items must correlate well. So this is internal consistency. Then we have something called inter-rater reliability. Remember the triangle which I showed you? So we're looking at 2 observers and how reliably they estimate the same phenomenon. So to assess the degree to which different raters or observers give consistent estimates of the same phenomenon. So for example, the Hamilton rating scale for depression. Now, you should establish this first before telling people to start using it in real life. So in other words, you must establish the credibility of this inter-rater reliability of Hamilton rating scale in another context before using it in the clinical context. Now, the second issue with that is you'll have to do it quite, how frequently should this be done in order to get reliability? And the third thing is you must training the raters. So if you want people to do it, 2 or 3 different people to reliably check this Hamilton scale, you need to have some classes for them. This is the scale. This is how it's administered. If you do all that and train them up properly on some maybe dummy patients being observed by somebody, then you will make sure that the inter-rater reliability is good. But it's also important because we really want people to do the same scale properly. You must invest in each of these areas. Now, some of the issues in reliability estimates are, first is sample size. Now, there are some calculations which can be done for reliability, validity, sample size calculation. And I can't explain those to you, but Dr. Jason will be the correct person to ask you for that. But the sample size calculation is based on the precision that you expect, how much precision you want in your final estimate, and also the prevalence of disease. So these are the 2 important variables that go into sample size calculation for reliability. A general rule of thumb is if you have 30 subjects, then that's adequate. That's a general rule of thumb. Now, the choice of sample should be done on a representative target sample population. So I want to look at inter-rater reliability on a group of depressed patients. I should do the test on a group of target population who is suspected to have depression. If I do about 30, it may be good. Then the thing is, you must ask yourself, how high the reliability index I think is reasonable. Now you may say, I want a kappa of 0.9. Somebody else may 0.5 is good. So you must make some sort of a decision with your group. What is that good? How good do I want it to be? So one of the guidance is, if that's going to make a big decision about treatment or prognostication or whatever it is, the more important that that reliability index has in the decision making, then you want a very high kappa for that particular study. So these are some of the issues about sample size and the choice of the sample. So just remember this, inter-rater reliability when the measure is an observation. You're measuring depression. You want to see how two different people rate, do the same Hamilton depression score. Test, retest is when the construct is measured over 2 points of time. And you also assume that there is no change in that particular construct or the value of that variable between the 2 times. When you want to test the homogeneity of different items, for example, the depression scale may have 4 items. You want to see, are they all moving the same direction? Are they all testing the same thing or saying the same thing? So the internal consistency of different items in one particular questionnaire, that is called internal consistency analysis. And the statistics some people use as a Cronbach's alpha. Now, that's a little bit about the kappa statistic. Now, we have talked about prevalence of disease. That means how many people have the disease in among the subjects you're testing. And how does that affect reliability and validity statistics? Now, I'm going to talk only about how prevalence and bias affect reliability statistics. We'll do about validity statistics in the next class. Now, this is the prevalence. This column is the prevalence of disease. Prevalence could be 1%, it could be 25%. Sensitivity and specificity are about a particular test. And this is the kappa statistic. So what I wanted to really focus on is, you can see that as the prevalence changes, the kappa statistic also tends to change. So the important message of this particular slide, I don't want you to focus on the sensitivity and specificity right now, but that is again for the next class. You will find that the kappa statistic is varied depending on the prevalence of that particular disease in that population in whom you are testing the kappa statistic. So just remember that you must adjust for prevalence. So why should you correct for some of these things? Randomly guessing on a multiple choice question, that suppose you're writing the NEET exam or the whatever exam you're writing, there are 4 chances. So just by randomly guessing, you know that there are only 4 possible answers. The student doesn't know any answer, but he should get minimum 25% because he randomly guessed. The observer may have a fixed prior probability. And if they know in advance that a population is predominantly normal or abnormal, let's say he knows that most of the answers are likely to be yes, then he may put yes for everything. Then he's likely to get a higher answer than, and probably by just chance alone. Randomly guessing itself, he'll get 25% if there are 4 questions. So these are the reasons why we must correct for chance. So I've also told you about prevalence now. Prevalence of a categorical variable, there is something called a prevalence index which one must calculate. This is the difference between probabilities of yes or no or normal and abnormal. So we'll come to that in a little while. The larger the prevalence index, smaller the kappa. So there are two things we must correct for when we're doing kappa. One is prevalence correction. The second is called bias correction. Now, bias is the difference in the proportion of no values in the two observers. So if you say that the two observers are going to say yes or no disease, and the other two guys, the same person, other observer is going to say yes or no, then you want to see that how often they're saying no. Both of them should say no in almost the same number. The difference in the proportion of the time they're saying no is called the bias index. As the bias index increases, kappa increases. So now we have a problem. The prevalence and the bias, both of them can affect the kappa, and we need to correct for that. So let's first look at the prevalence, the effect of prevalence on kappa. A diagnostic test that has high sensitivity and specificity may have low predictive accuracy when the prevalence of disease is low. Now that sentence I'm going to explain more in detail next time, just to tell you that the positive predictive value, which I'll teach next time, depends on the prevalence. So let's leave that for the next class. I'll come back to that again in the next class. The next sentence in yellow is most important. Two observers who seem to have a high agreement may nevertheless emerge with low values of kappa due to prevalence. So now let us look at the same example from Dave Sackett. Remember this example of 100 people with who the two people doctors are looking for evidence of diabetic eye damage, which is called retinopathy. Now, this is the same example. Just remember these numbers: 46, 32, 10, 12, 58, 56, 44. Now, it all stats people, so I'm sure that you'll be able to look at this 2 by 2 table and remember it. This table 1 is the same table that I've showed you in the previous slide, or something similar to that. Not the same table, sorry, something similar to that. Here we have 100 people, observer A and observer B. Observer B said yes to retinopathy a total of 49 times. Observer A said yes to retinopathy 46 times. They both agreed 40 plus 45, which is about 85 times about 100. So 85% is the observed agreement. Now, if you remember from the previous way how we can calculate the expected agreement, it is 0.5. And the kappa for this is 0.7, which you think is very good. Now look at the same study done by two different observers. The observer A changes here. Here you have 80 and 5, which is again 85. And you think, oh, that's wonderful. They agreed 85 times. The kappa should be very high. Here also 40 and 45, 85. So you have, oh, kappa, you're very happy. Here also 80 and 5. So the observed agreement is 85. But the expected agreement is 0.78. So you see there's a difference. And the kappa comes out to 0.32. So the table 2 has relatively symmetrical marginal totals, 85, 90, 10, 15. But the marginal totals are not closer to 50%. Here, the totals are closer to 50%. Both are almost 50%, 50%. Therefore, here, there's an effect of prevalence of disease. Therefore, the expected high chance has reduced the kappa. So here, if the expected agreement is large, the correction process can convert a relatively high observed agreement into a relatively low value for kappa. So here we have to do some correction for this particular problem. Now the second one is asymmetrical marginal totals can provide a higher value of kappa than balanced totals. Now, in this, I want you to focus on the totals here. Again, observer A, observer B, they agreed here. This observer 1 said yes 70 times. Observer no said yes 60 times. Whereas in this table, the totals are 60 and 30. So there is an imbalance in the or asymmetry in the marginal totals for yes. Here the kappa, you see the observed agreement is 60. Here also 60, 0.6. So you think the kappa should be the same. But you see here the kappa is 0.13. Here the kappa is 0.26. So this is called bias when the marginal totals are not the same. So this is a little bit of mathematics for you. First, you must do the prevalence effect. The best population effect of yes is given by, now you all know A, B, C, D are the totals from the 2 by 2 table. So the yes estimate is A plus B by the total n plus A plus C by n divided by 2. Similarly, the best estimate for the population answer no is C plus D divided by n plus B plus D divided by n divided by 2. The difference between yes and no is A minus D divided by n. This gives you something called a prevalence index. When the prevalence index is -1, when A is equal to 0 and D is equal to n. The prevalence index could be +1 when A is equal to n and D is equal to 0. The prevalence index is 0 when yes is equal to no is equal to 50% when the marginal totals are almost the same. The prevalence adjusted kappa is A plus D divided by 2. Paradox 2, when it's called bias, when the marginal totals are not 2. Difference of proportion of yes between the two raters. So here we do A plus B divided by n minus A plus C divided by n, which comes to B minus C divided by n. That gives you a bias index. The bias index is 0 when B is equal to C. Bias index is equal to 1 when B is equal to n or C is equal to n. Bias adjusted kappa is BAK is the value of kappa that results if B and C in our marginal totals are replaced by M. M is equal to B plus C divided by 2. So back, bias adjusted kappa. Now, unfortunately, Dr. Jay Seelan and his team have developed a software called NMaster, which one can do practicals, and you should all request him to take the practicals for that, where it's very simple. The same numbers are provided to you, and the software will calculate for you the routine kappa, the prevalence adjusted kappa, the biased adjusted kappa, and the best idea is to do PABAC, which is prevalence adjusted, bias adjusted kappa. So to avoid the paradox, you study choosing approximately equal number of positive and negative cases, or to reflect the clinical realities of the actual distribution of cases where F1 or the total of cases and F2 are unequal. So if you're doing a case control study, then you have roughly equal number of cases and controls. But in real life, you may get unequal number of people with and without disease or whatever you're testing, or the agreement may not be like that. So my advice to you, if you're doing a categorical variable 2 by 2 table, please do a prevalence adjusted, bias adjusted kappa. Then you don't have to worry about whether there was a prevalence effect, was there a bias effect, and should I have corrected for that? You just give the PABAC, and that's the best way to do it. So the observer A, yes and no. Observer B, yes and no. Totals N, M, M, and N. Payback is equal to 2 times the small n divided by the total n minus 0.5 divided by 1 minus 0.5, which is equal to 2 times the observed probability minus 1. The formula for the kappa here is payback minus pi square plus the bi square divided by 1 minus pi square plus the bi square. This is the mathematical formula for payback. Now, an example. Table 1, observer A, observer B. Observer A said yes, 46. Observer B said yes, 49. The agreement between both of them, 40 plus 45 is 85. So the observed agreement is 85. The bias index is 0.03. The prevalence index is 0.05. The kappa was 0.7 when calculated. The bias adjusted kappa came to 0.7. Now, here you see that in the second example is 80 and 5, which is an example from what I gave you earlier. And we know now immediately, oh, 85 looks like 85, but you can see the totals are going to be different. The observed agreement is 0.85. The bias index is 0.05. The prevalence index is 0.75. You can see that's different. And here the kappa here was 0.7. Here the kappa is 0.32. If you just do a bias adjusted kappa, you're not getting much change. But if you do a prevalence adjusted bias adjusted kappa, you get 0.7. So therefore, that's why the prevalence adjusted bias adjusted kappa is good for this methodology. If you have a symmetrical imbalance and an asymmetrical imbalance, symmetrical imbalance, here the totals 45 and 15. The total here is 70 and 60. So it looks very symmetrical, but there is an imbalance. 60 and 40 are slightly imbalanced, 70 and 30 are slightly imbalanced. The prevalence is 0.6. I mean, the observed agreement is 0.6. Bias index is minus 0.1. Prevalence index is 0.3. The kappa comes to 0.13. The bias adjusted kappa doesn't change much. It goes to 0.12. Here, on the other hand, is an asymmetrical totals. There's 30 here and 60 here, 40 here and 70 here. So there's a bit more of asymmetry here. So the prevalence still remains same. You have the observed agreement is 0.6. Here also 0.6. The bias index here you see is 0.1 minus 0.1. Here is 0.3. The prevalence index is 0.3 here. It is 0.1 here. The kappa agreement here is 0.26 here. The bias adjusted kappa comes down to 0.19. The prevalence adjusted bias adjusted kappa comes to 0.2. So you see 0.2, 0.2. So similarly here also the values are same. So this is what we're suggesting, that for every time you are going to do kappa, please just present the prevalence adjusted, bias adjusted kappa. So what is the weakness of kappa? Kappa measures exact agreement rather than a measure of an approximate agreement. It is not a weakness for dichotomous data. In polytomous nominal data, one pair of categories may be considered more dissimilar than another. Therefore, disagreements are worse than others. So now let's look at nominal polytomous data. If the categories of the polytomy are natural or fixed and they have no inherent order, for example, the blood group types, it doesn't make a difference whether A is first, then B, then AB, then O, or marital status, married, unmarried, separated, whatever, blah, blah. Then the overall unweighted kappa for the two sets of observations is the best measure of overall agreement. The overall kappa is an average, and that as such may hide the fact that one category accounts for most of the classification. So that's another important thing, that mostly A blood group, and the two groups will obviously agree with each other. They might have disagreed in the other blood groups, but the average kappa may be hidden in that because one group accounts for much of the data. So let's have a look at cross classification for this. So the pathologists A and B are looking at two cervical cancer. Now you can say cervical cancer is negative. There's one called atypical squamous hyperplasia, carcinoma in situ, or squamous cell carcinoma frank. And then there's invasive cancer. This is early and this is invasive. Now, two pathologists can have a look at it. And now how do we do that? Each pathologist rates all the people and then they give the score. And you compare the two and you make a table like this. Here you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is how you do a cross classification for a polytomous data. So for this, the kappa which you are supposed to do for polytomous data is called a weighted kappa. So weighted kappa is the index of agreement in which weights are maximal for exact agreement. And it's the index of disagreement in which weights are minimal for exact agreement. So you're looking at mostly for the weights are maximal for exact agreement. So you're waiting for agreement. And the formula is given here, K, and there is this big formula here. OIJ is the observed frequency in cell IJ. EIJ is the frequency which would be expected in that cell due to chance. WIJ is the weight given to that cell. WIJ is 0 for exact agreement, where I is equal to J. So this is the formula for weighted kappa. So weighted kappa incorporates the concept of partial credit for near agreement. That is providing differential weight which reflects a difference in the magnitude of disagreement. So it's a weighted kappa. It gives partial credit or differential weights. So there is something called category dependence of kappa. So here you have cross classification of subjects based on decile of sucrose intake for measured food frequency questionnaire administered twice, 1 year apart in a particular group of nurses done in 1981. This is the first questionnaire of deciles. This is the second questionnaire. And these numbers marked in red are where they agreed. So you give highest mates for where they agreed. And as they go away from agreement, you must start giving some weightage for that. So there is observed agreement, kappa, intra-class correlation by tables with different categories. So this is taken from this particular reference by McClure et al. In the American Journal of Epidemiology, 1987. So for a 12 by 12, the observed agreement will be so much, the kappa will be so much, and the intra-class correlation will be so much. So this particular table gives you the expected values for this in these kind of tables. As you can see, if you go for 12 by 12, then the kappa will be low. As you go for 2 by 2, the kappa will be 0.55, and the ICC value also is similar. So there are some differences as you start going to bigger and bigger numbers of tables. The kappa becomes smaller and smaller, and the observed agreement becomes smaller and smaller. Whereas ICC becomes higher and higher. So what are the problems with weighted kappa? Now you must have some decision which weighting system is appropriate. So are the measures of association or are we checking for measures of agreement? That's another thing which you must consider. So which weighting system? So here you have a primary observed primary respondent and a proxy alcohol drinking frequency. So one is where the observer says, the patient says, I drink so much. I don't drink. I used to drink. I have less than 1 drink a week, more than 1 drink a week, or more than 1 a day. And this is the proxy, or somebody else tells, or the family member says. The primary respondents were those in the heart disease controls. The proxies were the next of kin. So you ask the next of kin, do they drink? And then you try to look at agreement. So how do you weight this particular problem. So you can see that 47 they agreed, 6 they agreed, 19 they agreed, 54 they agreed, 99 they agreed. But how do you weight these disagreements? Which weighting system should you use? So this table gives you the estimates for weighted kappa under different weighting schemes. So the weighted scheme, the kappa and the standard error. Unweighted kappa says 0.5 and the standard error is 0.029. If you use the squared error method, then the kappa goes up to 0.79 and the standard error 0.02. If you use the absolute error weighing scheme method, then the kappa is 0.67 with a standard error of 0.023. So the first problem to be solved or resolved is to settle on the weighing or the weighting system, not weighing, weighting system. McClure and Willett have suggested using the squared error method, and the formula is given such: Wij is equal to 1 minus I minus j whole square divided by k minus 1 the whole square. And this is the particular method which McClure has suggested, squared error method. Next, we move on to intra-class correlation coefficient. Intra-class correlation coefficient. So the intra-class correlation coefficient, also called ICC, the number can vary between 0 and 1. Correlations are within a class of data. So the correlations are within repeated measurements of the same variable. So you're not taking height and weight, it's between height. So repeated measurements of height, how do they vary? So it is correlation of how height varies within itself rather than a correlation between two classes. So ICC is not checking the correlation between height and weight. It is between repeated measurements of height. Now there are several different versions of intra-class correlation, and the choice of intra-class correlation depends on the experimental situation. So the ICC characteristics. The ICC is sensitive to the extent to which subjects or individuals keep their ranking order in repeated measurements. So the ICC may indicate the ability of an experimental method to detect and measure the systematic differences between subjects. Now this ability is limited since those differences may or more or less be masked by individual variation. So if my height keeps on changing, like small baby, every day the height changes, then you say, oh, intra-class correlation is very poor. Individual variations of random nature between subjects. Now, the height clearly cannot change day to day, but the weight may change. Blood sugar may change within subjects between a time of day. Blood pressure will change. Errors of uncertainties of random nature. So just a random change. Then there are systematic errors in the measurement. Maybe this weighing scale keeps showing lower and lower weight as the day progresses because of some particular problem. Or the BP measure using mercury, the mercury level kept on falling in the BP apparatus. So there was a systematic change in the BP measure. So these are all problems with variation can lead to problems with intra-class correlation. For the ICC to be a reliable, or for the method which you're using to be reliable and useful, such unwanted variation should be sufficiently small. So ICC serves as a quantitative estimate of this aspect of reliability. So how is intra-class correlation coefficient calculated? It is calculated as a ratio. So it's equal to the variance of interest divided by the total variance. So in other words, the variance of the variable divided by the variance of interest plus the unwanted variance. If the unwanted variance is equal to or larger than the variance of interest, then you have a problem. For example, if the variance is between subjects, the reliability of the method is evidently poor. And then the intra-class correlation will have a value of below 0.5. If the intra-class correlation has a value of 0.8 or 0.9, then it has a good or excellent reliability. So this is how ICC is calculated. Variance of interest divided by the total variance. Now, the total variance is made up of the variance of interest plus unwanted variance. That's a variance between subjects. So that has to be kept minimal. So if the variance of interest is a certain amount, that should be bigger than that should be small, and the unwanted variance should be kept as minimum. So the intra-class correlation coefficient was originally presented by R.A. Fisher, and it was based on the analysis of variance or ANOVA, assuming normal distribution. Now there are other methods of doing ICC based on the maximum likelihood method and non-Gaussian methods. Now, there's one example. One of our colleagues, Dr. Abraham Pidikale, one of our colleagues, a senior professor, has looked at inter and intra-observer variation in the amniotic fluid index. Now, that's in pregnant women. You want to see how much of fluid is around the baby in the uterus. That fluid is called amniotic fluid. And there's an index calculated called amniotic fluid index. And it's very important because all pregnant women have ultrasound. And the doctor will say, oh, you have got a good amount of amniotic fluid, or you have too much of amniotic fluid, or you have too little amniotic fluid. Now you hope that the doctor to doctor, there's no variation. All the doctors must be the same answer for the same patient. So it's very important that the amniotic fluid index, there's no intra-observer variation, meaning the same doctor doing it twice on the same day of the patient should be the same amount. There should not be any inter-observer variation, that is between two doctors on the same patient on the same day, there should not be much variation. This particular publication was published in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. So what did they do? The objective was to measure the intra and inter-observer reliability in the amniotic fluid index. For the methods, three observers measured the AFI at random in 32 patients without knowing each other's results. So to determine the intra-observer reliability, each investigator made repeated measurements on 10 other patients. That is intra-observer reliability. Intra-observer reliability and inter-observer reliability were expressed as intra-class correlation coefficients. I hope that's clear. So this is between the three raters. Pairwise agreement among the three observers. Remember, there were three observers. So the intra-class correlation coefficient, ICC, was between observer 1 and 2, 0.75, and you can always do a confidence interval. Between observer 1 and 3, it was 0.69, and it had a larger confidence interval. And between observer 2 and 3, it was 0.57, and it had a confidence interval. Remember that nothing prevent you from giving kappa, and also you can, that is the kappa here, the value on top, and also the prevalence adjusted, bias adjusted kappa was also presented here. Those are the other values which were presented here. So this is the way that confidence intervals and the ICC is presented. This is, remember, the inter-observer variability. Now, inter-observer variability overall can be given. This is between 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 2 and 3. We can also give an overall agreement. The overall intra-class correlation, ICC, between all three was 0.67. And the confidence interval for that 0.67 was this. They also have given a kappa and a for this particular agreement. Now remember, I told you they also did intra-observer. That is, they had taken 10 subjects and all three of them done repeated measures on those 10 to look and see within themselves how they vary. Intra-observer variation intra-observer reliability, again ICC, the three observers between them was 0.82, 0.89 and 0.89 again between them within themselves. So this was reasonably higher than the inter-observer reliability, which was 0.67. So the intra-class correlation coefficient, some people say R, is not sensitive to change in the scale of measurement. Altering the scale does not affect it, and it also depends on the range. So there are some issues with intra-class correlation coefficient, which one must just be aware of. Now, I just want to give some more things to exemplify that story which I just said. Now there are two raters, X and Y. Those are the two human beings. They did 3 sets of ratings on 5 subjects. So they got the 5 subjects and did ratings. They call them 1, 1, 2, 2. So they could give any value between 1 to 5 on these 5 subjects. But they did it at 3 separate points of time. And you can see that in the set A, they seem to agree very well. Set B, not so well. And set C also not so well. But you can see this is exactly the same in set A. And set B, there was, when it was 1, it was 5, 2, it was 6, 3, it was 7, 4, it was 8, 5, it was 9. So purposely a pattern has been shown, but it's not like this. Here was 1, it was 2, here 2, it was 4, 3, it was 6, 4, it was 8, 5, it was 10. So clearly you won't be very happy with set B and set C. But let's look at what happens to R. This is a graph shown. This is how they change. So in set A, this is set A, this is set B and set C. Clearly the X and Y here are all exactly on the same line. That's because 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. So if you're drawing the graph, X and Y will be like this. R is 1. So go back again. When it was 1, it was 5, 2, it was 6, 3, it was 7. So if you look here, X is here and Y is here. So not good correlation, but the R value is 1. Here also, sorry, here you see, when 1 it is 2, 2 it is 4, 3 it is 6. So it's double. But again, X is going like this and Y is going double. But again, intra-class correlation is 1. So here, that's what we said here. So the scale doesn't seem to affect it. And it is not sensitive to a change in the scale of measurement. So there are some issues with intra-class correlation coefficient. So that leads us to the same study. They did something called a Bland-Altman plot, mean difference plot. On the x-axis is the average AFI index, amniotic fluid index. So all 3 people, average is put here. The amniotic fluid index could be 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. On the y-axis.
One small correction.
Yes, sir.
That is the problem with the simple correlation coefficient.
Okay.
The intra-class.
Sorry.
That is why we are using.
Okay. So just to reiterate what sir said, this R is a simple correlation coefficient, and that is the R which is given here. So this is the average amniotic fluid index. Here is the average amniotic fluid index minus the observer's amniotic fluid index. So we want to see over the whole range, how are the values changing? And you can see that when the amniotic fluid index was small, there was not much difference between the average AFI and the observer's AFI. It was within 2 standard deviation. As the amniotic fluid index went higher and higher, the difference seemed to become more and more. So this is very important for people to understand. Oh, as the amniotic fluid index seems to go up and up, then the observers seem to vary very highly in their values, and there's a big difference in their values. So this is something important to understand. So in the paper they published, this is what they wrote. The differences in measurement between the observers were slightly smaller in cases of reduced fluid. Patients with polyhydramnios, that is very large amount of fluid, were not included in the study, but the differences between the observers would probably be higher in these women. In clinical practice, AFI measurement in all patients who have biophysical assessment, no one knows the actual fluid volume. So we must be a bit careful when the amniotic fluid index is high by any one person. It is likely that there's likely to be a big variation between people. You can do some sort of correction factor for this later on, but that is beyond the scope of what I'm going to teach you all today. So what I would like to end with is what I started off in the beginning, that there are 2 or 3 methods of talking about a diagnostic study. The diagnostic study usually has a group of people whom you test. You have an index test and a gold standard test. And those indexes which usually people talk sensitivity, specificity, positive and negative predictive value, talk about the validity of a test. Reliability looks at how values agree among themselves. 2 people measure the same thing repeatedly. So that is reliability statistics. And when you want to do reliability, I will end with this particular slide here. Sorry, the slide which I want is not coming. That is this. If you have bivariate outcome variables, then you must use kappa. If they are polytomous or nominal, you must do a weighted kappa. If the outcome is continuous, you must do intra-class correlation coefficient. But just remember, even if they are continuous, a good way of showing the differences is to use the Bland-Altman plot. I must apologize and I thank Dr. J for pointing out that I showed you the simple correlation R. The simple correlation is not good because it can give you some wrong values. Because even when they're not correlating well, the value may look as 1. So with that, I'll stop. I have 10 minutes for questions. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Once again, you can put them on the chat box or you can unmute and ask questions. Okay, while you are all thinking about questions to ask, I would urge all of you to contact Dr. J. Seelan. The software which was developed is called the DX software or diagnostic software by the Department of Biostatistics, supported by IndiaClen. It does many diagnostic testings. You can do sensitivity, specific, all the validity statistics. You can do all reliability statistics. You can do diagnostic meta-analysis, which we're not covering in this particular session, group of sessions. You can do diagnostic meta-analysis. You can do ROC curves, which you are going to cover in the last of this lecture series. So I would urge all of you to write to him, and then maybe you can have some practicals on that if that interests you all. Or you can contact the Biostatistics Department in CMC, Dr. Prasanna. He will be able to help you all with that with the help of Dr. J. Seelan.
So if no questions, we'll stop here, Tanbu. This is a wonderful lecture. We thank you for this lecture.
Thank you very much, sir. I hope that I didn't put everyone to sleep or I didn't make it too confusing for everybody. But once again, sir, I would acknowledge
there is a question, I think.
Thank you for these slides, sir.
There is a question there.
Yes. Calculating the sample size based on prevalence of sensitivity for an index test acceptable. Now I'll give you an answer, Priya. I'll ask Dr. J. Seelan to add on. Now, when you do a sample size testing calculation for a diagnostic test, one should use the estimated sensitivity and the estimated specificity for a diagnostic study. But that is for a diagnostic study where you're looking at the outcome of validity. That is, you want to check the validity of a test. That is, you want to estimate the sensitivity and specificity. Now, when you want to look at sensitivity, that's people with disease, then the prevalence comes into play. Let's say the prevalence is 10%. Then if you study overall 100 people, only 10 people will have disease. That's a sensitivity aspect. So you need to know the prevalence and the estimated sensitivity and specificity. But that is not what I'm talking about today. That's about validity. But if you want to do a reliability statistics, then I would just say that one has to have some sort of idea about what you expect the kappa to be. And the rough rule of thumb is 30. But I would actually ask Dr. J. Seelan to expand on sample size calculation for reliability.
Yeah, the reliability study, basically, we are talking about the correlation between the two methods. Basically, the range for the intra-class correlation is 0 to 1, let's say. So if I have to do a study between two methods, how reliable they are, it's like in the psychiatry example, there's no gold standard. Then I would fix my R, some value like 0.7 or 0.8. And say how much the precision would be. So it could vary by plus or minus 0.1% or 0.1 or whatever. Then put your alpha error and beta error and decide your number. This is the total number that has to be studied. And the total subject have to go through the evaluation by the investigator 1 or method 1 and method 2. And that is how we calculate it. So use your the intra-class correlation coefficient value and decide the sample size. That is the easiest one. On the other hand, validity, that you have a gold standard. Therefore, it deals with the disease plus and disease minus. So you have to have D plus, sensitivity and specificity. And as Tambu said, you carefully look at the prevalence of a problem in that setting and then decide your number for disease plus and disease minus. That is how you need to decide sample